Hello, this is Mark Sunday. I'm a Duncan Seminar Ambassador, and today we're going to be talking about basic glazing, the process where we apply a color to a fired bisque surface, refire it to get a specific effect. Now glazes come typically for the most part, in 4-ounce jars, something like this one. And they also come in pints, and also you can find them in gallons and larger quantities. But for the most part, the bulk, the majority of glazes that are out on the market are packaged in these jars, 4-ounce jars. Now, we're going to talk about how to apply the color, and also I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the problems that you encounter with glazing and how to fix them, hopefully. And then also we're going to talk about some techniques on how to use the glaze. But first, let's talk about the preparation for glazing. And the first thing you need to do is set up a clean work area with water bowls, paper towels, sponge, your brushes, and I'm going to talk about the brushes here in a minute. Also something to mix the glaze with. Palette knife will work, or a plastic spoon. Also some clean mixing cups. Because one of the problems that you encounter is, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. Now, getting back to the area for preparing to glaze. Also, you see I have a drying rack here. That's optional. You can also use kiln stilts. But now, let's get to the application part. We're going to be using soft bristle brushes. Now, there's several different types that are out on the market right now. Typically, you find one that's like these 1-inch bristle brushes, or maybe even a fan glaze. The point here is it's important to use soft bristles. Okay, anything stiff, like a stain brush, you won't get good coverage. You won't get the proper application that you need to have a successful glaze project. So I'm going to use the fan glaze brush for the demonstration here. Now, most of the pieces that we encounter that people make these days, for the most part, there's a lot of like utility pieces, decorative pieces. Glazes can go on all those things. Now, we're going to show application, I'm going to glaze this cup. And one of the things we like to do with particularly a utility piece like this is we want to glaze the entire surface, inside and out, because you don't want water penetrating into the bisque while you're using it, water or food or drink. So I'm going to demonstrate a technique we call rolling as an easy way of getting this inside surface completely covered. But first, one thing you want to make sure you do is when a piece of bisque comes out of the kiln, a lot of times there's dust on it, just from the way it's fired. You want to take a damp sponge and lightly go over the piece, inside and out. Now, you don't need to really have a soaking wet sponge for this, just a damp one. Something that will go over the piece and make sure you get any of the dust off. Because, as I said before, dust is very detrimental to glaze. And we want to take that sponge, you want to get down in there and try to get the whole inside wiped out. Okay? Now, to get the inside of this covered, I'm going to do a technique we call rolling. And I'm going to use clear glaze for that reason, for this technique. I'm going to pour quantity of clear glaze, full strength clear glaze, into a clean mixing cup. Now, one caution here is you should never use your brush on the inside, taking it inside the glazed jar. You should always use these mixing cups, just some clean mixing cups. It keeps the glaze from being, the glaze in the jars from being contaminated. Now, I want to thin this down to about the consistency of milk. Now, this particular clear glaze is still pretty thin. It's in pretty good shape, so it won't take much. And just add a little bit of water at a time. Because remember, you can put it in, but you can't take it back out. Now you see, this is about the consistency. See, it's about the consistency of milk. And this makes it easier to roll the glaze. Now, what I'm going to do is just pour this in. And I'm going to start rolling it around gently. See, I want it to cover the entire surface, but I don't want it running out all over the place. So, one thing I do here, I'll show you, is I put my finger up against the edge. This is just to bring it up to the edge here. I go back down, move my finger around. And you see I work my way around the cup until I get the glaze. Covered on the entire surface, interior surface of the cup. And then pour out the excess. And just set it down to drain. Now, I'm not going to put this back into the jar. Because it's been thinned down, it's not the same consistency as the original product. So, I'm going to put this in a separate container. This can be reused. I could use this on other pieces without any problems. In fact, if you can, you could put it in a separate jar and just label it for as thin or rolled glaze. But again, you should never put that back in the original container. Now that it's drained out sufficiently, I'm going to check it to see that there aren't any drips down the side. And if there are, so you just take a damp sponge and wipe off any drips or any glaze that splashes on the outside surface of the cup. And you see I've covered the entire interior in an even coat of glaze. You do not need to repeat this. One application, one rolling is enough. Now, let's work on the outside. I take another clean cup and I take my jar of glaze and I pour some into a cup, and you see it's pretty thick. Now, for brushing glaze onto a piece, a good rule of thumb is to thin it to the consistency of heavy cream. Now, this came out pretty thick, so I'm going to add a little bit of water, and I'm going to mix it up. Remember, I'm looking for the consistency of heavy cream. And you see, I'm pretty much there. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is when you're applying glaze, it's very important that you read the directions on the bottle, because for the most part, the instructions on all the different glazes that are out on the market, they're all pretty much the same, but they tell you a wealth of information. One of the things they tell you is how many coats to put on. So most of the time it's 3. There are some cases like clear glaze that is 2 coats. And there's other glazes, maybe there's some reds out there that take 4 and 5 coats. But the instructions on the jar will tell you that. The other thing it will tell you is what to fire it to. Usually witness cone, 06, obviously to mix it well. And also that it will take, in this case, water cleanup. You can clean your brushes with water. So, the other thing it will tell you, most of the glazes will tell you, is to apply 3 flowing coats. And I'd like to explain what that means. Flowing coats is a way of making sure that you have a sufficient amount of glaze to get the type of finish that you want. So, what I do to apply a flowing coat is I wet my brush. If the brush is damp, the glaze will flow onto the piece smoother. Okay, a dry bristled brush will give you some, will make it more difficult. Now, you dip the brush into the color. And you want to load the brush so it's not dripping off the brush. That's too much glaze. You start to apply your color, and when you start to hear a scratching sound, that's when the brush is running out of color and it's time to reload. And it's a good idea on the first coat to apply the first coat in one direction, whether it's up and down, side to side, whatever works for you, as much as you can. Now typically on a piece like this where you have a handle or something, sometimes you just have to kind of work around it. You may not be able to go in the same direction in order to get it completely covered, and that's okay. But for the most part, a rule of thumb is to apply the coat in the same direction, let it dry, and then go back on the second coat and go the opposite direction. And then for the third coat, switch directions again. Now, because the bisque is absorbing water out of the glaze, it's going to require you to load the brush more frequently in order so that you avoid that scratching sound that I was referring to. Now, it's also very important to make sure, it's very important, to make sure that the glaze dries completely between coats. Now you see I've applied it here, it looks pretty wet. And here is what it looks like when it's dry. And I'll put a wet stroke right next to it. It has kind of a chalky finish to it, and applying, you can see the difference here when it's wet, and this is the same glaze as dry. When it's dry, it's got a chalky finish to it. Now, I'll go over this entire piece. The directions on the jar say to apply 3 flowing coats. So I would apply my 3 coats in the way I just described to you. letting it dry completely in between coats. And then I'd fire it, stilt it, and fire it to witness cone 06. Also, in between coats, it's a good idea to wash the brush out. That's why in the directions on the jar it says water cleanup. It's a good idea to wash your brush out in between coats. That also helps in the application. Now, one of the things I'd like to explain at this point is when you are applying glaze. Now this utility piece makes it pretty easy to cover because it has a smooth surface. We also have pieces out there that have more detail in them, such as like this Christmas tree. Now Christmas trees have typically have a lot of detail in them. And I'd like to give you some pointers on how to get good coverage on a detailed piece like this. And where you're using a glaze that picks up the detail. Now, loading the brush, I like to, I found that it's easier with, particularly with a Christmas tree like this, to actually work from the bottom up. And again, you're applying flowing coats, which means you're trying to avoid that scratching sound of a dry brush, of a brush that's running out of color. Now, when I'm applying this, I just do a small area at a time to make sure, or small strokes at a time, to make sure that I'm getting it covered, and two, to make sure that the glaze doesn't puddle up in the detail. Now, just like on the other piece, where I have, I'm trying to work in one direction, I can do that on the first coat. The second coat, it might be a little difficult, but it kind of depends on the piece as to whether or not you can change directions. A lot of times, see, if you do that, you might actually get too much glaze puddled up in the detail, and that'll cause you problems in the firing. So my best advice is you just kind of do the best you can. You have to make a judgment call depending on the piece as to whether or not you can change directions. A lot of times with a detailed piece, it'll hold more color. Now, since we're on the subject of applying color to this Christmas tree, let me give you a couple of pointers that I've found. Whenever you're glazing a Christmas tree, usually they have the holes already drilled in them. Well, one of the things I've found is just don't worry about it if you get some glaze in the holes. I mean, you're not wanting to fill them deliberately, but if you get some in the holes, I'd say don't worry about it. After you get the 3 coats on, one thing I've found is to take it's called a spiral or a spoolie brush tool. Take and wet it with some clean water, and just go in here and clean out the hole. And just to be on the safe side, to make sure there's no problems, because see, when that glaze gets into the holes, it could either plug up the holes or constrict them so that you wouldn't be able to get your lights in. And you don't have to do this until after you get the third coat on. So now another way you can make sure, if you have a particular piece that has a lot of detail in it, and I picked a Christmas tree because their characteristic is they've got a lot of detail in it. One thing that I've actually done on the third coat is I've taken a sponge, dip it in the glaze itself, and just kind of give it a light coat, a light tapping of color on the tips of the branches. That'll hit those raised high points in the detail that you've been brushing over and possibly pulling off some of the previous coats. And it doesn't take that much. It's just dipping it directly into the glaze and patting it onto just the tips of the branches. Okay. So that's the application of a detail piece. And again, I'm cleaning my brush out. And so now we have applied the glaze to smooth finish. We've rolled the inside. We've worked on some detailed pieces. What I'd like to do now is talk briefly about some of the different types of glazes that are out on the market right now. They fall into, I've kind of grouped them into 4 different categories. The first being a transparent glaze. A transparent glaze is one where any underglaze that you apply to the piece will show through. Clear glaze is the best example. And I have a couple of pieces here to illustrate what I'm talking about. This plate has underglaze on it, and you can see the transparent glaze that's been applied to it. The underglazes show through very well. Likewise, this cup. The cup has, the design shows through the transparent glaze very well. As I say, clear glaze is the best example of a transparent glaze. Now you also have semi-transparent, and those are glazes that are designed to bring out the detail in a piece. And they bring out the detail, they shade, put in shadows, and highlights as well. They generally have come out in variegated shades. And a good example is this cup. The denim blue glaze that's on this cup really brings out the detail and makes it look like worn denim cloth. Then you also have opaque glazes. Now, opaque glazes are generally for solid coverage. You apply those, if you apply those over underglaze, it's very, very chancy that the underglaze is actually going to show through, depending on what the underglaze is and what the glaze is, as to whether or not it will actually show through. But for the most part, opaque glazes and also semi-opaque, where they're partially solid coverage, they have kind of a variegated shading in them. And then, like this cup, is an opaque red glaze that will give you solid coverage. Very little variation in shading. There are also satin glazes out on the market. Those have a matte finish to them, like this cup here. It has a satin glaze on it, very dull, muted color. And then you also have what I call specialty glazes. They're glazes that have unique characteristics to them. Like, for example, they may have specks in them, like this piece here, or this cup here that has not only specks, but it has little metallic flecks in it. Then you also have like dimensional glazes, where once applied, they hold their shape. Piping is a good example of a dimensional glaze. And then another specialty glaze that's out on the market that's very popular is called the crystal glazes. Now, crystal glazes, I'm going to demonstrate their use here on a little project. Crystal glazes mostly come in 4-ounce jars, and what's unique about them is that they have baked crystals attached to the bottom of the jar, like you see here. And crystal glazes mainly consist of some base color as their foundation, and then complementary colors of crystals. Usually 2 or 3 other colors, sometimes more, depending on the color scheme. But what's unique about them is that those crystals, when they're fired, they'll flow in the kiln and create interesting effects. And this is kind of what the crystals look like. They're baked chunks of glaze that once fired will melt and flow. The bigger the crystal, the more they'll flow. And I'm going to show you kind of how we apply crystal glazes when we come back. Okay, welcome back. Now I'd like to talk about crystal glazes and how to apply them. As I said, crystal glazes, they have glaze chunks adhered to the bottom, attached to the bottom. What you want to do is take 2 clean mixing cups and pour off about the top 2/3 of the jar. The crystals will remain in the bottom. And again, just like before, you want this to be the consistency of heavy cream. Now, I've taken a vase here and I've put a complementary color, already rolled it on the inside, and it's dried completely. And I'm going to show you how we apply crystal glazes. The first 2 coats are applied just like any other glaze, 2 flowing coats. So, like before, I take my glaze brush, load it with glaze. You see I'm going in one direction, and you're going to see crystals. Most of the time you'll see crystals show up in these first 2 coats, and don't worry about it. The bigger the crystal, the more they're going to flow in the firing. So what you have to watch out for is mainly, if you get a few of these small crystals on the bottom, it's not a big deal. You shouldn't have any problems, but if any big crystals get on there, they're going to cause problems in the firing. So anyway, I'm going to apply 2 flowing coats. First coat, letting it dry. Come back with the second coat, going in the opposite direction. And letting it dry in between. Now, while the second coat is drying, I'm going to take the other mixing cup and I'm going to get in there with a palette knife or plastic spoon, and I'm going to dig up those crystals. This is where I dislodge them from the bottom of the jar and dump them out into the mixing cup. And again, I'm going to make sure it's the consistency of heavy cream. This is already pretty close there. It's going to appear a little thick because of the crystals, and you can see as I'm running my palette knife through, see the chunks in there? Well, that's what you're looking for. Now on this vase, I've already got my 2 flowing coats on this side. So I'm ready to do the third. Now for the third coat, here's a good rule of thumb. Whenever you're applying crystals, try to keep them at least an inch off the bottom. Don't put any on the bottom whatsoever and come up about an inch. That'll give you some breathing room to account for any crystals that may flow. And then I take my glaze, and this is the cup that has the crystals. I'm going back to the glaze that I had my original, that I did my first 2 coats with, and with the third coat I do the bottom, and about an inch up, from the bottom, because remember, you still have to have 3 coats, 3 flowing coats. Then I go into the cup that has the crystals in, and this is where I start to apply the crystals. And you want to be cautious of where you apply them, because remember, if they get clumped up together, several big crystals, well, that's going to be like one massive flow in the firing. So you want to be wary of where the crystals are going to be placed on the third coat. And it really depends on the effect you're going for. And then see on this side, this has the third coat on it, and this will give you an idea of what it'll look like once you get that third coat on. And you see I've got the big crystals kind of spaced out. They're not all clumped in one area, and they're not, you see, they're not anywhere near that 1 inch. I'm keeping them off that 1 inch from the bottom. The idea here is I want to get these to flow beautifully and create an interesting design. Now, as I said, let it dry thoroughly. It's very important that glaze be completely dry before you put it into the kiln. Otherwise, you're going to cause problems. It's also equally important that, and I should have mentioned this earlier, unless it's specifically called out for in the instructions, you should never put glaze on greenware. Crystal glazes, any kind of glazes, they should not go on greenware. When greenware fires, it gives off gases, as I said earlier. And those gases will push up and ruin the glaze finish. They'll push up through and penetrate the glaze, ruin the finish. And then, going back to the crystal glaze piece now. Now once you put this in the kiln, fire it to witness cone 06, you'll get, see, it's quite a spectacular conversion. This is before going in the kiln, and this is after. And you see the big crystals, how they flow down the piece, creates a beautiful effect. Now, for you teachers and shop owners out there, this is an excellent project to do with beginners, because when they see that they've done something that's kind of dull looking like this, and then have it come out of the kiln looking like this, they'll feel like they've really accomplished something, and they have. They've created a very beautiful piece. Okay. Now, that's crystal glazes. When we come back, I'm going to show you some techniques for using glaze. Hi, welcome back. Now I'm going to show you a couple of techniques with glazes to give you some interesting results. One thing that I'm going to talk about is called glaze layering. And glaze layering is a technique where you use two different colors of glaze on a piece in alternating coats to get some different effects and to bring out the detail in a piece. And I have a pumpkin here that I have done glaze layering on. And basically the way glaze layering works is you start out with two complementary colors. Now I use two colors on this pumpkin. Pumpkin orange and another color called sunset red. The sunset red being a red-orange glaze. Now my first coat, now I applied 3 coats just like I would any other glaze. The first coat is the pumpkin orange. The second coat is done with sunset red. And then the third coat, you go back to the original color, which is the pumpkin orange. First coat, pumpkin orange. Second coat, sunset red. Third coat, pumpkin orange. And what this will do for you is it brings out the detail in the piece and also gives a little bit more variation in the fall colors that you like to see in pumpkins. Anyway, so that one is done in glaze layering. Okay, another project that you can use with the glaze layering on is Christmas trees. Christmas trees have a lot of detail in them, and so using the glaze layering technique where you alternate the colors will help you bring out the detail in the tree. Now, like for example, on this tree, I started with a Christmas tree green. Now, for the second coat, for the first coat, for the second coat, I could come in with something like emerald green, which is a little bit darker, and do it for the second coat, and then come back with the Christmas tree green on the third coat, allowing them to dry in between coats. The other benefit to this is because the two glazes in the jar are two different colors, it'll help you see where you've been. On a detailed piece like this, that can be an added benefit. So that's pretty much what glaze layering is. Now, in the instructions that I'm providing with this video, I have some color combinations and for some suggested uses of the glaze layering. Now, another technique that I'd like to demonstrate for you today is called marbleizing. And as you work and do different glaze projects, one thing that's inevitable is that you'll come up with a collection of jars of glaze with small amounts in them, where you might just have a little bit in the bottom of the jar you don't quite know what to do with. Some are half empty, half full, and also partially used. Well, marbleizing is a good way of using up those leftovers, as I call them. Now, get yourself a piece of foil and a plastic spoon, something you want to marbleize. Something with a smooth surface is preferable. Take a spoonful of glaze and just pour it out on the foil. And whatever colors you pick is entirely up to you. Use your own imagination as to a color scheme. I'm using a red, a green, and a white here. You see, I let the colors touch each other on the foil. Then I take my spoon or palette knife and I just pull them into each other gently, kind of like you're doing a marble cake. You don't want to mix them. All you want them to do is just pull into each other. Then take something with a smooth surface. Now I'm using an Easter egg for demonstration purposes here. Take and stick it into the glaze. And you see how it's dripping? Well, just kind of let those drips go because it'll create a pattern on the piece as the glaze is drying. And what you're going to do is completely cover the piece. Once you get it completely covered, just set it down to dry. You can set it on a drying rack like this, or even on a kiln still. Once it's completely dry, you fire it to witness cone 06, and you'll get something like this. So you have a beautiful marbleized piece. Now you only have to run it into the color one time. It'll put sufficient amount of glaze on to get those 3 coats. Marbleizing is a very simple, easy technique. As you can see, it's a way of using up your leftovers, and it's also a good project for kids and that type of thing. So that's marbleizing. Now what I'd like to do is talk to you about some of the problems that happen, that occur in the glaze firings, and how to possibly correct them. Now, one of the more common problems in glazing is called cratering or bubble glaze. And what happens there is on the smooth surface of the glaze, you'll see what looks like blisters. Like blisters you might get on your skin from a bad sunburn. You'll see blisters, and what's happened there is usually it's because of underfired glaze, underfired bisque. The bisque has not been fired to the proper cone 04. And like I said before, when greenware is fired, it releases gases. Well, if you don't fire it to maturity, that gas will remain trapped in the body of the clay, in the bisque. And so when you put glaze over it and it goes back into the kiln heats up the piece again, and those gases actually push up through the glaze finish, causing a blister. It could cause a blister. Another problem is that it also could cause crazing, where it actually cracks the finish of the piece. Like we have here. Now, this was a piece of underfired bisque that has some clear glaze over it, and because of its, the bisque wasn't fired completely, the finish of the glaze actually cracked. This is what we call crazing, and I've put some color on it to highlight it here so you can actually see the cracks. Now, this is recoverable, just like with the bubbles. Same thing applies. What you do is just go back over this with a little bit of the original glaze, and then stick it back in the kiln and fire it to the proper witness cone 06. And most of the time that takes care of the crazing or the bubbles. Now, another problem that happens too with glazes is if the piece comes out and it has a cloudy finish to it. It's almost even white or kind of foggy looking. What's happened there is there's too much glaze on the piece, and sometimes the glaze will actually do what we call slump, It will actually run a little bit when, when it's over applied. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. And so, with particularly with the shiny, the glossy glazes, if it has a white, milky look to it, that's because it's been over applied. A lot of times that'll show up on a real detailed piece in the creases and crevices where there's too much glaze. Now, another problem that you often see is called pinholes. And pinholes, likewise, are caused by immature bisque, immature fired bisque, where greenware gases are trying to escape. And in some cases, like we have here, you actually have where pinholes are pretty much caused, a lot of times they're caused by dust. And as I said before, dust is very detrimental. And there's actually a couple of things that, a couple of problems that you see that are caused by dust. One is the pinholes. The other is what we call crawling. You see, dust, when glaze encounters dust, it repels. It literally crawls away from the glaze surface. Just like what you see here. It's actually crawled away to the point where it exposes the bisque. Now, to fix this, this is actually pretty easy to fix. You just go back, I'd wipe it off with a damp sponge, and then go back with the original glaze and pat it on here either with, with a brush or with your finger, whatever, and put the right amount of glaze on, and then refire it to witness cone 06, and that'll usually fix that problem. Now, one of the other problems, you see, it's kind of the opposite to the cloudy. If you get like on a satin finish like this, if it's particularly shiny, if there's some spots it's real shiny, that's also due to over application. And a lot of times there's really not a whole lot you can do about that. You can try to refire it to witness cone 06, but most of the time, if it's over applied, there's really not a whole lot you can do because it's fired onto the bisque body. Now, another problem that comes up is, like you can see here, these streaks in the glaze finish. This is due to basically a dirty brush. A lot of times if you don't clean your brush out properly, you can see this looks pretty much like a brush stroke here. If you don't clean your brush out properly, that glaze will show up where it doesn't need to be, or where you don't want it to be. And again, there's not really a whole lot you can do about this other than maybe put a darker color over this and refire it. But it stresses the point that it is very important that you clean your brushes properly, both in between coats and in between colors. Lastly, the last problem that I'd like to show you is, I've talked about over application. Well, this is kind of what a good demonstration, a good example of what happens when you don't have enough glaze on a piece. In the case here, it looks like there's about maybe one coat here on this piece. And you see it's very rough finish, discolored. It's even got some of the original color, like it shows in the jar on this piece. My guess is there's about maybe one coat applied here. This is very easy to fix. Go back, put two, I would even put an extra coat on in this case because it's so rough. Coats back on this and refire it to witness cone 06. And it should be okay. And you see the difference here between under applied and the proper application. See, there's a big difference there. That's why it's very important to get those 3 coats, 3 good flowing coats. Okay, those are some of the typical problems that you see when you're firing glaze and doing glaze projects. And with this video, I hope I've shown you some of the basic glazing process, the techniques, given you some ideas on how to do some little variations, and also hopefully inspired you to go out, pick out some glazes you like, and come up with some beautiful projects. And again, I thank you for your attention.